Want to advertise your business in a cost-effective way? It's time to give podcast advertising a try. Research shows a high rate of podcast listeners made a purchase as a result of an ad they heard on a podcast. Visit podbean.com/brands to launch a cost-effective podcast advertising campaign in minutes. That's podbean.com/brands.
Lady Justice is a true crime podcast, therefore deals with incidents of violence, disturbing imagery, and explicit content. Listener discretion is advised. The Lady Justice podcast wishes to offer their deepest condolences to the victims' families and wishes to offer thanks to those that work in emergency services. Hello my lovelies and welcome to another episode of Lady Justice, a true crime podcast. Lady Justice is a weekly podcast that covers fascinating cases both past and present. My name is Chantel and I'm your friendly true crime junkie with slight caffeine addiction issues. I hope you are all doing incredibly well and have had a wonderful week. As usual, before I get into this week's episode, I do just want to ask you guys a huge favour. Please support this podcast by subscribing, rating and leaving a review where you can. And because sharing is caring, I do want you to go tell everyone you know, share it on social media and get the word out. It would make the world of difference. If you'd like to contact me about anything at all, please, feel free to do so via social media or my email, which you'll find in the show notes. When a police sergeant was involved in a car accident, he had a large object wrapped in the back of his van. A few weeks later, a body was recovered from a river. This is the case of Police Sergeant Strangler. So, without further ado, here is some background on the location and time frame of this crime. We are travelling back to 1966. Yeah baby, it's all groovy. Queen Elizabeth was as stylish as ever and the Prime Minister Harold Wilson was busy calling a snap election. The UK was abuzz with football fever as England prepared to host the World Cup, which I think we won. The trophy was famously stolen and found in a hedge by a mongrel dog called Pickles. The Rolling Stones and the Beatles topped the charts. 1966 was also the year that saw the Moors murderers Ian Brady and Myra Hindley go to trial, angry chef himself Gordon Ramsay born, and the legend who will never give you up, Rick Astley, not letting us down by gracing us with his birth. We are heading to Gateshead, just over the River Tyne, opposite Newcastle in the north of England. It's a nice little part of the world, and famous folk born there include Gazza himself, Brian Johnson, the AC/DC frontman, and Sir Bobby Robson. Daniel Defoe also came from Gateshead, the author of what is considered to be the first novel written in English, Robinson Crusoe. We do have a secondary location in this episode, that being a city south, Sheffield. Known for the role it played in the Industrial Revolution, it was given the nickname Steel City. It is now much more commonly known as a cultural hub, and the birthplace of Jarvis Cocker. One of my favourites, Eddie Izzard, who grew up there, and Sean Bean. And surprisingly, this isn't something that Sean's going to die in. As always, all my sources will be listed in the show notes. So let's get on it like a car bonnet. It was a cold, biting morning on March 10th, 1966. George Lishman, a 39-year-old silo checker, had already been at work examining the barley cargo at Mills Wharf, Gateshead, when at 8:45 a.m. he made a gruesome discovery. He was busy at work when something caught his eye floating in the River Tyne, in between the quayside and a Dutch ship called John V. At first, he thought it was just some quilting that had been discarded as rubbish and went to pick a stick to recover the fabric. It was as he prodded the suspected quilt that he felt it harder than he would have expected. Then he saw skin. He panicked as he ran, shouting to his workmates that there was a body in the river. The police were called immediately and arrived on scene. They used a frogman to recover the body from the cold river and searched the area for further evidence. Detectives huddled around the docked ship and pondered where the body had come from. It was still evident, even though the corpse was in a bad state, that the victim in the water was female, and there had been most definitely foul play involved. As the woman had been laid out along the shore, police noted that there was a leather belt around 1 inch in width, with a buckle removed tied around the neck. The unidentified body's feet were bound with twin grey plastic flecks. Tied to the flecks was some rope, and at one end it had become extremely worn and frayed, suggesting that there could have been a weight attached to it at some point. The first point of concern that detectives were to do was to establish the victim's identity. A woman had clearly been strangled with a belt and dumped in the river. Chief Inspector William Ewington of Gateshead CID took lead on the investigation. Forensics found very little at the scene. It was a busy shipping area, with many boats passing through the area, and it was most certainly possible that the body may not have surfaced in the water where it had been first placed. The Tynemouth leading to the North Sea was only about 10 miles east, and it was considered that possibly the killer had placed the body in the river, hoping it would be taken out by the tide out to sea. However, the River Tyne, even more so than it is today, has always been busy, and there would have been far better places for the body to be placed. On the 6 o'clock television news that March 10th evening, it was reported that an unidentified female body had been found on the busy quayside. A woman watching the news from her living room in Gateshead suddenly looked up at the grainy picture, as the reporter gave details of the police for those that may have further information. Details of how she was found were withheld by police, as they often do, to help distinguish real suspects, so what was reported seemed vague, but it was enough to make the woman's stomach drop. Jean Armitage looked at her husband sat on the armchair. He shared the same look. Could it be their friend? She'd been missing for 5 weeks now. No one had heard from her. She knew Gateshead. They picked up the telephone and asked to speak to Gateshead Police. The whole area was shocked and saddened by the news. The police had received some calls after the news report about the woman, and a young police sergeant from Sheffield arrived at Gateshead Police Station. He was ushered into a quiet room by detectives, who asked about his wife, her hair colour, body type, height, clothing. The 35-year-old officer answered the questions politely, with an air of concern in his voice and manner. Left in the room, twiddling his thumbs for a few minutes, he was asked if he could escort them to the mortuary at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital. When they arrived, the mortuary assistant gave a warning to the man and the officers. The body was swollen and the skin had turned black. This wasn't a sight for those with a sensitive disposition. As he lifted the sheet from the woman's face, the man's eyes glazed for a second. "Do you know this woman? Is this your wife?" "I can't be sure." "Is this your wife, sir?" "No." His voice and face didn't say the same thing, however, and the officers picked up on this. They didn't say anything more, but just shared a look between themselves. They took the police sergeant back to the home of his friends, a Mr. and Mrs. Armitage. When the 2 detectives arrived back at the station, they were updated on the new developments, the very little that had happened. Chief Inspector Ewington informed his team that an officer from Scotland Yard was making his way up north to help with the investigation. Due to the police sergeant's arrival, inquiries with Sheffield Police had produced an interesting piece of information. The police sergeant's wife had not actually been seen since January 31st. They suspected they knew who they'd found in the river. Another police force, 125 miles south, had suspicions too, yet the husband had yet to confirm it. The 2 detectives that had accompanied the husband shared the offence of the visits to the mortuary, and it was decided they would contact their presumed victim's son to see if they could find any further clarification on their suspicions. On March 14th, 4 days after the recovery of the body from the River Tyne, Detective Superintendent Ian Forbes of Scotland Yard called a press conference at Gateshead Police Station. They had a positive identification, that being of Sheffield resident Winifred Jessica Hepa White. He stressed to reporters that they wished to speak to anyone that may have seen the woman since January 31st, especially focusing on the County Durham, Tyneside, Newcastle and Yorkshire regions. He continued to say, "We are working in close cooperation with Sheffield Police and are working hand in hand, and that the inquiries were pretty widespread." Asking if Scotland Yard was taking over the case, he told press, "I'm only here as an advisor. This is a Gateshead inquiry, and it's very much a joint effort." Whilst he praised the work of Chief Inspector Ewington and his team at Gateshead CID. The investigations were highly publicised and the public were alarmed. The police did feel some pressure to perform. The clothing that had been recovered had been sent to the Northern Forensic Science Laboratory in Gosforth for examination, and statements were taken from across the northeast in an effort to trace the victim's movements. One big hurdle that the police faced was that they did not know when or where the body had entered the water. It had been a particularly cold winter, and experts agreed that this could have made it far more difficult to determine. All shipping activity was examined, yet no clues came to light, so they focused in on what they did know. Winifred Jessica Hepa White was known as Winnie to friends and family. She was a 49-year-old mother of two who had been missing since January 31st, 1966. Police had started to piece together a picture of the woman and her life, desperately hoping to know how she'd come to such a tragic end. She'd previously lived in the Gateshead area with her first husband, with whom she had 2 children, Raymond and Susan. His sudden death had left the young single mother to make a move to Sheffield, where she settled in the northwest Walkley area, a typical suburban neighbourhood. Her life was pretty average, very much a woman of the time, getting her hair set at the hairdressers weekly and described by those in the area as pleasant. As her children grew up, she met a man a few years younger than her. His name was Kenneth White, 14 years her junior. They fell in love fast, perhaps too fast, and they got married. To the outside world, they lived a normal, happy life, quiet and unassuming. On August 31st, 1965, there had been an accident on the A1 road at Kimblesworth in County Durham, in between Durham City and Chesterley Street. 2 lorries collided with a coach filled with travellers. Tragically, the bus driver was killed and a further 21 injured. Winnie and her daughter were passengers on the coach, and there were some of the 10 passengers so badly injured that they were taken by ambulance to Durham County Hospital. Susan was found roaming the grass verge with a head injury, causing amnesia, and Winnie had been found laid across the road with serious head and hand injuries. So bad were Winnie's injuries that she was kept at the hospital until November 23rd, 1965, before being transported home. At this time, she was still bedridden, and her daughter Susan Beard, who was at this time about 20 years old, had decided to stay with her mother and stepfather in Sheffield. Trying to get back some form of normality, Christine Hazelwood, an 18-year-old hairdresser, began to visit Winnie at home for her weekly hair appointment. She told reporters after the discovery of Winnie's body, "She was a very pleasant woman, and when I went to her home, she spoke about the coach crash. She said she was sat reading on the back seat when she was hurled through the back window." The accident clearly had a profound effect on the mother and daughter. Susan was out of her employment for 5 weeks due to her nerves. A spokesperson for the accident said they were surprised to receive a claim for damages from a Sheffield solicitors on behalf of Winnie in the early December of 1965. At about this time, Winnie was just getting back on her feet. The owner of her normal hairdressers told of how he had seen her in those weeks. She was walking with the aid of a stick, and apparently it was the first time she'd been out. She was very cheerful and seemed to be recovering from the accident quite well. To validate the claim against the coach company, Winnie's solicitors had arranged an examination at a specialist on the 7th of February, which is something we're going to come back to. So the investigation continued with the 20 CID officers beginning to look at every aspect of Winifred's life. As we all know, you are more likely to be murdered by someone you know, even more so by a spouse, and this wasn't looked over by the police. Winnie's husband arrived on Gateshead from the 11th of March, the day after the discovery of her body, until the 14th, in which the announcement that the police made a positive ID. Before Kenneth left, he told of how he hadn't seen his wife for a few weeks and informed them that she would never go anywhere without her handbag, but he could not speak to the contents. On the 17th of March, appeals were made in the press that issued accompanying photographs of a tan leather purse with a yellow ship motif with a gold clasp. This, however, led nowhere. Inquiries were made into where Winnie was last seen. Officers working within Sheffield Police spoke to numerous witnesses. Winnie worked part-time at the West End Hotel on the city's Glossop Road, and there were many independent sightings of the 49-year-old leaving the property an hour before afternoon closing at 4 p.m. on January 31st. Winnie's daughter had told police that she had last seen her mother on that same day, at about 7:30 p.m, before she left her childhood home for the evening. Raymond, Winifred's son, had moved away to the Lake District a year previously and hadn't spoken to his mother in a while, although they had regular written correspondence. He had told officers that he hadn't received any mail from his mother in about 5 weeks, which matched the end of January date of her last confirmed sighting. Police in Gateshead were also questioning a number of known friends and acquaintances of the Hepa White couple. Winnie's parents, Mr. and Mrs. March, who lived in Bamford, had spoken to police and stated that they could not be sure but believed that they may have met their daughter in Sheffield during early February. They were an elderly couple though and were not too sure of the dates. Winnie's parents had grown frustrated with the investigations and spoke to a reporter at the Chronicle newspaper. Mrs. Marsh was recorded as saying, "We don't really know what is going on at all, only what we read in the papers. Ken is over in Gateshead and we are not in touch with him at all, although we are hoping for a telephone call from him today to let us know what is going on. He is staying with close friends that they have known for a long time in the Gateshead area." Detective Superintendent Forbes rebutted this when interviewed later, understanding the family's annoyance at the pace of the investigation. "You could think that there was a lull, but I can assure you there is a lot going on in the background. Although we are working in close cooperation, there is bound to be some lapse in time." Detectives had a window of time in which they knew Winnie must have disappeared, and most likely murdered and disposed of in the river, over 100 miles away. Between January 31st, when many witnesses had spoken to last seeing her, and the date of the appointment made by her solicitor to see a specialist on the 7th of February, all eyes were on Kenneth for answers. Why had he not reported his wife missing? What, if anything, was he hiding? Why had he not positively identified his wife's body when he visited the mortuary? And why did his own police force suspect him of wrongdoing? Kenneth White was a 35-year-old police sergeant attached to the Woodseats division of Sheffield Police. He lived on Fir Street with his wife Winnie and seemed, for all intents and purposes, a damn good citizen. Before his promotion, he worked as a detective constable with the Hamilton Road CID. Whilst he was in this post, he'd actually been a minor witness during what was called the Rhino Whip Affair. The Rhino Whip Affair brought the South Yorkshire Police Force into disrepute. During 1963, it was revealed that inside the Water Street police station, some of the grimmest episodes of violence and corruption took place against prisoners. Within the interview rooms, detectives of a specially selected squad brutally beat suspects with stolen weapons, including a Rhino whip. They fabricated evidence in a bid to frame detainees too. This was all happening under the approved authority of leadership, and this led to many resignations and shame. It is best summed up by the words of the 42-year-old decorator from the city, John Anderson, that said, "Scrap it and start all over with a new lot. The corruption's too deep. No one trusts police." This was, in part, why officers like Kenneth White were so valued. He kept the force in the good graces of the public. Just 3 years later, with one of their residents, Winnie, having been killed and taken to a different county, the South Yorkshire Police took this opportunity to help prove that the police force was doing better than before. It is also the reason why they took a hard look at one of their own. Kenneth wasn't a hugely private person, about the same as your average lot. Yet he did not tell anyone of his wife going missing. Hell, even when her body was discovered, he told colleagues that he was actually just on leave. The first mention that he'd made to his wife being missing was when he rang Winnie's solicitor after receiving a letter 8 days after a missed appointment, saying to the receptionist that she'd left their marriage. He didn't know where she was, but there was a possibility that she was in the Lake District with her son and his wife. The second and last mention was made to Jean Armitage, the woman who had seen the news report and rang police on March 10th. The two couples were close, and when Jean had called to speak to Winnie about the 24th or the 25th of February, Kenneth told his friend that Winnie had left and not been heard from since. The lack of perceived concern was troubling for his superiors. Kenneth White's commanding officer, Chief Superintendent Bowler, asked for the young officer to come into the station for a quick chat. Asked in relation to his wife's disappearance, and the fact that he had not made a police report stating such, he claimed that she had just left him and he was ashamed. He could not expand further on why she had not taken any of her belongings from their marital home, or why she had not been in contact with her own children. He was then questioned on his whereabouts on the night of January 31st. He was not scheduled to work that evening, as he had been on regular night shift with the force for several months. He said he'd just been out for a drive, and then began to feel unwell, so retired to bed. Bowler, on the other hand, knew more than what White was telling him, and in one of the very interview rooms that he had worked in, charges were put to Kenneth White in that he had murdered his wife. His reaction to being charged? "I categorically deny being implicated in this murder and plead not guilty to this or any offence." On the 22nd of March 1966, a 6-minute hearing took place at Sheffield Magistrates Court. The evidence that was used to charge Kenneth was, perhaps, seen as a bit weak, yet not all that unconvincing. Bowler had asked to provide his basis for the charge to the court, in which he testified. At 11:25 p.m. that same day, in which he meant January 31st, the accused was seen at Wetherby, where he had been involved in a minor motor accident whilst driving his Hillman Husky van. He said that he was travelling to Newcastle. This was the evidence that White had failed to disclose when being interviewed. The forensic evidence that had been gathered during the investigation, although most still undergoing testing, had supported the police's hypothesis. Kenneth stood tall in the dock wearing civilian clothing. The judge granted him legal aid and remanded him into custody until the 30th of March. When seen again at Sheffield Magistrates on the 30th, White's solicitor, Mr. Clive McKeague, made the claim that the police and the Public Prosecutions Board did not have enough evidence to bring charges against his client. He questioned Bowler, "Is there anything you can say to their worships, which can give an indication that the defendant is linked with this murder?" Bowler responded yet again the circumstantial evidence of Kenneth being seen driving on the night of Winnie's suspected disappearance, and the minimal forensic evidence. The justice decided this was enough though, and decided that a trial would be held. The trial of the police sergeant took place at Leeds Assize Court beginning on June 15, 1966. It was overseen by Justice Willis and lasted 14 days. Kenneth White pleaded not guilty to the murder of his wife. Opening for the prosecution was Mr. Stanley Price, Queen's Counsel, and spoke to how relations between the couple had severely deteriorated over the course of their marriage, and said that Winifred had taken a strong dislike to her husband and his police work. Continuing to describe their cat and dog life, in which they barely spoke or saw one another, he told of how friends and acquaintances of the Hepa Whites said how Winnie was abusive and contemptuous towards her husband and his job. His ignorance of the issue just made the woman madder. He went on to talk about how Winnie had confirmed to be alive at about 7:30 p.m. on the last day of January by her daughter. The jury was then told a curious story from the same night, which occurred on the Great North Road in which the minor motoring accident happened. He was, in fact, driving his wife's body north from Sheffield to put it in the River Tyne. Being involved in that minor accident, he was spoken to by several officers. He told them that he was a police sergeant and was going to Northumberland to see his wife who had been in an accident and was injured. The West Riding police officers helped him on his way. Later in the trial, the officers that had attended the scene of the accident testified to observing a large object which was wrapped in a sheet in the back of the van. Questioned on why they did not investigate further, they admitted it was in fact just due to Kenneth being a fellow police officer. Forensic evidence was given by a number of experts. Notably, Dr. Bernard Knight, the Home Office pathologist, was to testify to the cause of death. He claimed that he had found no positive indication that she had died from drowning, and that his official ruling was she died by asphyxia due to strangulation by ligature. During the cross-examination of Dr. Knight, the defence laid out their claim of Kenneth White's innocence. The defence had claimed that due to the strained relationship, Winnie had it out for her husband and would take him down in any way she could, even if that meant she would lose her own life. Mr. Lyons QC, leading the defence, stood before the courtroom and declared that Winnie had committed suicide fashioned to look like murder. She had done this to friend Kenneth and ensure he went to jail. Questioning the pathologist, he tried to lay doubt at the door of the prosecution. Has it not been known for a person committing suicide by drowning to rig up the body to make it look like murder before the body has gone into the river? Very rarely. Then he requested to know what became of Winnie's body after her post-mortem. The body had actually shortly after examination by Dr. Knight been cremated, to which the defence launched an attack. Why was it not made available for other independent pathologists to examine, as it was widely known that especially in murder trials, pathologists were known to disagree wildly. Delving deeper into this rabbit hole, Mr. Lyons then questioned Dr. Knight on the evidence he had brought before the jury. The pathologist had claimed that the strangulation was most evident due to the putrefaction that had occurred on the body. The pressure of the belt had produced a groove which would not have shown otherwise. The strangulation had also caused hemorrhages found on the tongue that were distinctive from those that would have been caused by putrefaction. Lyons then asked, "Is it not possible for a pathologist to make an error in the nature of a hemorrhage?" Dr. Knight said simply, "Yes." The defence's theory was hinged on the same principles as the prosecution, but differed in the actual perpetrator of the victim's death. Was it suicide because of a hatred of her husband, or was it a husband murdering his wife because life just looked that bad? The woman who had initially called police about the identity of the body in the river, Mrs. Jean Armitage, testified to the court the state of the Hepa Whites' relationship. She explained that Winnie hated her husband with quite unnatural intensity. She was like a wild animal. It was a frenzied hatred. She wanted to break Ken's career and him. There was no justification for her hatred. If she'd accepted him, he would have made a marvellous husband. Jean explained how she'd known Winnie for 17 years and the couples often visited one another. She told of how she'd never known Kenneth to be abusive and said to how upset he was in regards to his wife's attitude. Asked her opinion on which of the two scenarios seemed more likely to her, Mrs. Armitage testified, "I think she has committed suicide. She was so determined she would have gladly given her own life if she could have dragged him down." Winnie's daughter was next to swear to the Leeds courtroom. Susan Beard told the court that her mum had discussed divorce with her in the January she disappeared. She also spoke to a piece of evidence, that being a solicitor's letter to her stepfather, stating that Mrs. Hepa White alleged that she and her daughter lived in fear of Ken's violent attacks. Susan also said that the contents of the letter were a pack of lies, and that her stepdad often stayed out of the way to avoid any trouble. The defence asked if he was like a lodger in the family home. Susan declared that a lodger would have been treated better. Mr. Raymond Beard, Winnie's son, who identified her body, said in court, "Hepa White said she had kept on leaving him but came back. He never knew where she was." Beard admitted when crossed by the defence that his mother was bad-tempered. He addressed a letter written to him by his mother which said, "I'd stand up to the devil if he walked in here. Come to think of it, I often do." Raymond also admitted that he'd once talked with Kevin about how he thought his mother would come to a sticky end because she had a mean eye. Justice Willis asked him to confirm what he meant, and Beard said, "I mean an evil eye." When he was asked on who he had thought killed Winnie, whether she did herself or her husband, he said she was vengeful, but she would never have committed suicide because she was too strong a mind for that. By Friday 24th, Kenneth had given evidence over 12 hours over 4 days. It began with questions to why he had not positively identified his wife when being accompanied to the mortuary. Mr. Hepa White said that when he was shown the body, he described how the face was just a horrible, bloated, black mess, and how he really, at the time, wanted her just to be alive. He said, whilst at his trial, that he now accepts that it must have been his wife that day in the mortuary. The prosecution had scoured through the evidence, especially the interrogations, looking for any mishaps by the defendant. They had noted one thing, and as Kenneth was being cross-examined, Mr. Spencer Price asked, "To the people who asked you when was the last time you saw your wife, you did not always give the same answer?" Kenneth replied nervously, "No, sir," and then went on to explain that he wasn't telling untruths. He was just unsure about the actual date he'd last seen her. He then said that in the time since he'd been on remand, and had thought about the timeline of his wife's disappearance, he could now say that he must have seen his wife last on the morning of February 1st, when he was getting into bed to recover from the flu. He was then questioned on why he had not reached out to anyone about his wife going missing. Had he inquired with a single soul? Did he not find it strange? Kenneth said that he had made contact with Winnie's mother, as she was fully aware of their domestic issues, and assumed that she may have made her way to visit her parents. When that failed, he did not try any further. "Not even her friends?" he was asked. "No, sir." The prosecution put to Ken what had really happened on that day. It was claimed that he dragged his wife's body down the back steps of their home on First Street, Sheffield, and into the back of his van. Asked if he transported the body on January 31st, Kenneth told in a clear voice, "I am positive that Mrs. Hepa White's body was never in my vehicle, and I am certain that Mrs. Hepa White never came to any harm at First Street. Had the police searched my car in Wetherby, I am positive I would not be standing here today." Now, is it just me that finds it totally peculiar that he refers to the woman he was wed to, not by her first name, but by a formal Mrs. Hepa White? Does that not actually strike anybody else as a bit strange? By Monday the 27th, the trial had begun to wind down. For the Crown, Mr. Stanley Price QC opened the closing speeches passionately. He explained how Kenneth was resourceful and capable with an intimate knowledge of police methods and procedures. To the motive, he added, not merely confronted by domestic strife, but confronted by the possible separation with the attendant publicity of divorce. With greater publicity, he saw that as something which endangered his career. He was determined to keep all his domestic difficulties swept under the carpet and not have them brought into the open as to endanger himself. Mr. Lyons QC for the defence gave a hearty speech to the courtroom in his closing argument. This case has been exemplary for the zeal and recklessness in which theories and speculation have been thrown before you in the guise of proof, when, in truth and in fact, they were substitution of proof. He then proceeded to say there was no motive for murder and no need. All Kenneth would have had to do was wait, as according to witness testimony, Winnie was going to leave him anyway. Justice Willis began his summing up, addressing the jury. It is my duty to direct you in this case that there is no evidence of such provocation as would to justify you. If you thought the accused killed his wife intending to kill her, in returning a verdict of guilty of manslaughter but not guilty of murder, you cannot convict on suspicion, however strong that suspicion might be. You cannot convict on speculation, and you cannot convict on the balance of probabilities or a combination of all three. In this case, if you think it is reasonably possible that Mrs. Hepa White committed suicide, of course you will acquit. The jury had been absent from the courtroom for 3 hours and 5 minutes on Wednesday the 29th of June, before the ushers declared the foreman was ready to give their verdict. The panel of his peers had found Kenneth guilty of the murder of his wife, Winifred Jessica Hepa White. The foreman stressed that they recommended mercy on the defendant, and the judge passed down the sentence of life imprisonment. So that's the end of this week's case, and I would like to balance out the scales a little and make the world a little nicer for everyone to be part of. So it's time we do a small act of kindness. This week I propose to do something I have very recently benefited from myself: reconnecting. I have been long estranged from one of the closest friends that I've had in my life, which is very unusual for me. Lately though, we've been talking and it's really helped me and my mental health. It's made my world just a little bit brighter. This is all something we should try, even if that means that we've got to give a little apology to make it happen. So with that, go be good people, go be kind, go be safe, and most importantly, go be happy.